This YCN segment is brought to you by M.J. Harrington and Company, jewelers and designers since 1948.
Coming up on this week's edition of YCN News Vermont Wrap, we'll take a look at this week's top news stories. We'll also check in with Tom Anderson, Vermont's Commissioner for the Department of Public Safety, and we'll play Progressive Potpourri, unpacking some of the stories that will make you shake your head in utter amazement and quite possibly disgust. I'm Keith Hanson. YCN News Vermont Wrap is next.
This YCN segment is brought to you by Mount Sunapee Resort. Fun for all seasons.
Welcome back to YCN News Vermont Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. On Friday, Governor Phil Scott was expected to sign into law House Bill 333, which establishes legal requirements for facilities with single-user restrooms to be, quote, gender neutral. Scott's signature on this bill firmly cements yet another legislative win in the books of the progressives of the Green Mountain State. In addition to further adding credibility to the arguments that gender is a fluid concept, it normalizes a condition that, up until very recently, has been defined as a mental disorder. That is, until the American Psychiatric Association yielded to the political power of the progressive movement, changing the designation of transgenderism in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders from a mental disorder to a softer, more gentler gender dysphoria, which, for those of you that don't have your dictionaries handy, is defined as, quote, a state of unease or generalized dissatisfaction with life. You may recall that early on in Trump's presidency, he revoked the federal guidelines which permitted so-called transgendered students in government-run schools to choose a restroom based on the gender that they identified with and not their biological sex. State lawmakers, however, indicated that this piece of legislation was not initiated in reaction to any of Donald Trump's policies. Last week, Brattleboro Union High School added itself to the small but prestigious list of schools hoisting the Black Lives Matter flag over their campuses. Seemingly emboldened by the success of other high school students in other areas of the country in lecturing the adult populations about matters of political and social significance, Brattleboro has become the latest municipality in the state to give the organization entrenched in social Marxism yet another opportunity to indoctrinate public school students. Brattleboro School Board voted unanimously in April to permit the students to raise the banner. As a result, the black flag with white lettering was flown at 3 campuses in Brattleboro: at the high school, the Brattleboro Area Middle School, and the Wyndham Regional Career Center last Friday, May 4th, which the town has declared Diversity Day. The chair of the Brattleboro School Board, Ricky Davidson, said he was glad to give students a voice and an opportunity to speak and be heard. Vermont State Police officials are now soliciting feedback from the public on how they do their jobs. Vermont State Police Director of Fair and Impartial Policing, yes, that's right, Fair and Impartial Policing, Lieutenant Gary Scott, announced a 13-question survey earlier in the week, which represent questions that were developed by a subcommittee of the Fair and Impartial Policing Group. That group is comprised of activists representing progressive organizations which include, but is not limited to, the Pride Center, the LGBTQIA Alliance of Vermont, the Rutland chapter of the NAACP, the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity, Straight Talk Vermont, and the Safe Space Project. Those inclined to take the survey can visit the link located on the bottom of your television screen. Is a fiscal crisis looming for the Green Mountain State? Well, you can judge for yourself. In its attempt to give the warm, snuggy feeling to the public sector employees, the state, with a total population of right around 625,000 residents, has managed to dig itself into a hole to the tune of right around $4.5 billion. That's right, billion with a B, in unfunded liabilities for the pensions of state employees and state educators. Now, in case you weren't aware, unfunded liability is a fuzzy pink bunny way of saying a debt we owe that we have no foreseeable means of paying for. On a recent episode of Onion River Community Access Media's Vote for Vermont program, Vermont Business Roundtable member David Coates indicated that last year alone, Vermont came up $85 million short on its annual required contribution or pension fund payment. That represents a 50% increase in the deficit from the previous year. And with no viable means outside of taxation to make up that shortfall, Vermont could see a downgrade in its bond rating, among other credit rating penalties. We're going to take a quick break, but when YCN News Vermont Wrap returns, Tom Anderson, the Commissioner for Vermont's Department of Public Safety, will join us from Waterbury. We'll be talking about last week's decision to block the implementation of roadside saliva tests in an effort to determine drug intoxications on motorists suspected of DUI drugs. You're watching YCN News Vermont Wrap. We'll be right back after this.
This YCN segment is brought to you by New London Hospital, an affiliate of Dartmouth Hitchcock.
Welcome back to YCN News Vermont Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. Joining us from Waterbury, from the Vermont Department of Public Safety, Commissioner Tom Anderson. Commissioner, thanks so much for being a part of the program this weekend. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So one of the things we talked about last week, of course, was the rejection of a roadside saliva test by it was at the Senate Judiciary Committee, the legislation House Bill 237, now not permitting the state and, more importantly, law enforcement officers to move forward with a roadside saliva test. Now, you penned an op-ed in part with Chief Jennifer Morrison, the president of the Vermont Chiefs of Police Association, and Sheriff William Bonyak, president of the Vermont Sheriff's Association, all three of you representing the Department of Public Safety, state police, the chiefs of police of the respective municipalities, and the county sheriffs, all expressing concern about the ability for your law enforcement officers to effectively and adequately test people, not only for intoxication via cannabis, but other types of drugs. Where do you go from here?
Well, as the op-ed points out, I mean, those are the three organizations that represent most of the law enforcement within the state. So law enforcement clearly understands the issue, clearly understands the problem, and has recognized that oral fluid testing, or saliva testing as it's commonly known, is really an important tool that law enforcement needs to protect the motoring public in Vermont and elsewhere against impaired drivers. You know, we're in the throes of this heroin epidemic where marijuana is about to be legalized in July 1st, and that if we go the way that Colorado and Washington have gone, there will be an increase in the number of roadway deaths related to marijuana. So I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what saliva testing is. It's less intrusive than taking blood, which is the way we have to do it right now. And it really is akin to a breath test that's taken in drunk driving cases. It's far less intrusive. It can happen much closer to the time of operation. I mean, some of these processings for drug driving offenses can take 4 or 5 hours. So it's an important tool. I think it would go a long way to giving law enforcement in Vermont the tools it needs to protect the motoring public for those that are that use impairing drugs and then get behind the wheel of a car.
Now, unlike a blood test, which is invasive and would require a warrant issued from the court, the roadside saliva test does not require a warrant. What is the processing time from that? From the time that the test is administered, the sample is gathered, presumably it's not something that it's an instant presumptive test that would have to go to a crime lab facility. From there, what's the turnaround time approximately?
Yeah, so as I say, there's a lot of misinformation about what it would be. So it's very similar, and it's very to the roadside breath test. So as you know, in Vermont anyway, you know, police officers take a preliminary breath test. It's sort of a screening device. It's not evidence. It's not admissible in court. Same thing with saliva. There'd be a screening test that would screen for certain impairing drugs. If that tested positive, then an evidentiary sample would be taken, like we do with breath right now. We take an evidentiary sample that is then analyzed by the lab. So we would have an evidentiary sample of saliva that would be tested by the lab, just like we test blood now, and it would come back to the prosecutor with a result whether the person had an impairing drug in them. The difference would be it would take a significantly less amount of time to process someone, and it would be really akin to how long it would take to process someone for a drunk driving charge. So it would be more in line with that type of timing, which can be an hour or 2 hours, depending on what what's going on at the incident.
Now, as you had indicated in your op-ed, Governor Scott made it clear that highway safety was, and I'm quoting from your op-ed, a critical component of marijuana legalization. Do you feel as though the governor rushed the signing of this legislation into law? Do you feel that these are the types of issues that should have been addressed and had remedies put in place prior to a marijuana legalization bill being signed into law?
Well, I think the governor's made pretty clear, and I think in his statement he did when he signed the law into the law legalizing marijuana on July 1st, that any further legalization of marijuana, the full tax and regulate, was going to require addressing roadway safety. And this is one of the things that the governor is fully supportive of, that would be the types of things he's looking for to address roadway safety. You know, the other thing I'd say is the need for saliva testing isn't going to magically appear when marijuana becomes legal. We have needed this type of tool for any number of years. So, you know, the Senate, unfortunately, the Senate is not going to be able to look at this bill this year because it was not voted out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that's the second time it hasn't been voted out of Senate Judiciary. It passed 2 years ago out of the House, and again it died in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So, to answer your question, no, I think that this is something we've needed, whether marijuana is legalized or not. And I'd also point out that Vermont decriminalized marijuana in 2013. It's kind of similar amounts.
On July 1st, Vermont will become the 9th state to recognize the recreational use of marijuana. How long between the 1st of July and the opportunity to sign a new piece of legislation into law that specifically addresses intoxication testing?
Well, I think, our legislature is about to adjourn. They'll come back in January. So, assuming that this legislation doesn't pass this year, I still hold out hope that maybe they'll see the light. That it would be introduced again next year with the new legislature, and it would go through again committee hearings, hopefully get out of the House again, and then be again in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And the fate of it there is unknown at this point.
We need to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Vermont Department of Public Safety Commissioner Tom Anderson when we return. Don't go away.
This YCN segment is brought to you by Echo Communications, a digitally integrated commercial printer.
Welcome back to YCN News Vermont Wrap. Joining me from Waterbury, from the headquarters of the Department of Public Safety, is Public Safety Commissioner Tom Anderson. Commissioner, again, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure.
In terms of the numbers of highway deaths in the Green Mountains state, last year, approximately how many highway deaths were there?
I'd have to get back to you with those statistics. What I can tell you is, if you give me a moment, is that when we decriminalized marijuana in 2013, we did see an increase in the number of marijuana-related fatalities. In fact, we saw a 28% increase in marijuana-related motor vehicle crashes in the 3-year period post-decriminalization. And as I said earlier, Colorado and Washington have seen dramatic increases in the number of marijuana-related fatalities that they've experienced since they legalized marijuana in those states. And those numbers are, in Colorado, they went from 55 deaths in 2013 to 125 deaths in 2016. And in Washington, they went from 66 deaths in 2012 to 116 deaths in 2016. So as you can see, if Vermont follows the pattern that we saw in Colorado and Washington, that we can expect additional fatalities on our highways once marijuana becomes legalized.
But yet, despite those numbers, the state has chosen to legalize what many, including myself, feel clearly is a gateway drug. Now, there's some people who have used marijuana recreationally and have not become hardcore drug users, but a disproportionate number of people who are currently using hard drugs or who have a history of using hard drugs got their start using marijuana. Also, given the fact that when you're seeing large of the harder drug seizures, the heroin, the fentanyl, the carfentanil, the cocaine, oftentimes there's cannabis or cannabis derivatives, whether it's the green leafy marijuana, whether it's the butane honey oil, whether it's the hash oil, the paraphernalia. Oftentimes, the marijuana is accompanied by those harder street drugs that are identified under the blanket term of this opioid crisis. Are you missing an opportunity by legalizing marijuana to have the ability to detect marijuana, which would necessarily, under a normal situation, provide the probable cause necessary to conduct a warrantless search to be able to identify those harder street drugs and get those off the streets?
Well, if your question is, will it impact search and seizure law in the state, that remains to be seen, but I think it's safe to say that there will be an impact to search and seizure law, well-established search and seizure law by case law once marijuana becomes legal. Now, that does not necessarily mean it's going to pose an insurmountable obstacle to detecting, searching vehicles, or arresting those that are bringing this poison into the state of Vermont. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that, but it certainly will have an impact on search and seizure law.
And one final question very quickly. As far as being the 9th state to legalize the recreational use of marijuana, despite an absolutely nightmarish fiscal climate in the state, there's no mechanism for the regulation, sale, and taxation. What you're basically saying is, well, we're just going to legalize it, but it really doesn't eliminate the private street sales of the drug. It just now legalizes it for recreational purposes. Do you see the amount of crime and ancillary crimes associated with people trying to get money for drugs going up as a result of this? And why didn't the state institute a mechanism for the sale and taxation? I mean, at least if you're going to legalize it, make some money off it.
Well, I think I think you have to look at it two ways. One is, we decriminalized marijuana in 2013 and small amounts of marijuana. We've now legalized small amounts of marijuana. So the idea that it's going to create some issues with respect to people using it, or whether we're going to tax and regulate it. I know there are bills that have been passed or that are currently in the legislature for that. I don't think they're going anywhere this year. My guess is they're going to come back next year. The other thing I'd point out is, in my conversations with counterparts in Colorado, is that the idea that this is going to be some great economic boon to the state, they're not seeing that in Colorado. I mean, they're telling me it's basically a wash between what they have to spend to tax, what they have to spend to regulate it, additional law enforcement, that they're not seeing the influx to the state coffers that people think it's going to be. So I haven't run numbers on that, but at least that's what they're telling me anecdotally.
Commissioner Tom Anderson from the Vermont Department of Public Safety, I want to thank you again so much for being a part of YCN News Vermont Wrap. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Coming up next on YCN News Vermont Wrap, we're going to take a peek at political potpourri. We're going to be talking about some of the important stories that broke this past week that just make your head spin. More with YCN News Vermont Wrap coming up after this.
This YCN segment is brought to you by Harris Family Furniture in Plymouth, Laconia, and Chichester.
Welcome back to YCN News Vermont Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. Well, in this week's political potpourri, we spun the wheel and settled on Black Lives Matter. Now, I find it fascinating that a state like Vermont has drawn so much attention from Black Lives Matter. Now, at its core, what does Black Lives Matter profess to be about? Well, they talk about police brutality. At least that's what you've probably been led to believe. That police officers, primarily white, are out there murdering black and brown people en masse. By the way, these are the same police officers who the left would have you believe are the only ones that should have guns. Try to figure out how that works exactly. The people who are responsible for murdering minorities, at least according to them, in mass numbers, are the ones they want to entrust as being the only people permitted to carry firearms. But I digress. Well, this past week, the Brattleboro Union High School, along with the Brattleboro Area Middle School and the Wyndham Regional Career Center, I got to read that because I want to make sure that I get that correct, was one of the most recent municipalities to hoist the Black Lives Matter rag above its campus. That's right. Instead of focusing on the important things that kids need to learn. Of course, this is a government-run school, so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that an organization like Black Lives Matter has been permitted to sink its fangs into it. I also guess we shouldn't be surprised that in the state of Vermont, which has the Department of State Police introducing a survey that was written by organizations like, and I'm quoting, the Pride Center, the LGBTQIA Alliance of Vermont, the NAACP, the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity, and the list goes on. In fact, what department of the Vermont State Police is initiating the survey? The Department of Fair and Impartial Policing. Now, to save you the time for actually having to go to the website and check this out, up on your screen, you're going to see a screenshot from the Black Lives Matter website. Notice that on Black Lives Matter's guiding principles, we see restorative justice, diversity, globalism, queer affirming, loving engagement, empathy, transgender affirming, black villages, black families, intergenerational. Nowhere on the Black Lives Matter website do you see anything about the way that police officers are allegedly treating people of color. Black Lives Matter shows itself on its website as nothing more than an organization that indoctrinates children with soft social Marxist theology. Again, I guess we shouldn't be surprised that in a state like Vermont, we're seeing Black Lives Matter. This infestation, this infection of progressivism is not only destroying the state, it's destroying the children. I guess, considering that Vermont's major export now is no longer lumber, it's no longer maple syrup, it's your children, maybe they're going to take this ideology and hit the bricks. That's going to do it for this week's edition of Vermont News Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. Email address on the bottom of the screen. Please be sure to share with me your thoughts. Also, follow me on Twitter at @RealKeithHanson. That's at @RealKeithHanson on Twitter. And I guess I have to end by just saying this. For those of you that think I need to be more, soft and lovable and inclusive, this is for you. Have a great week to everybody. We'll talk to you next week.